And I wonder, what would you say that you were? Are you an encourager or are you a discourager? Are you someone who builds others up or are you someone who tears others down? Are you someone who refreshes people or are you someone who wears them out? Would you say that you motivate people or would you say that you demotivate people? Now, I suspect that if we are honest with ourselves, we would have to say that we are a mixture, that we would like to consider ourselves to be encouragers, but perhaps from time to time, maybe without meaning, we discourage. So, for example, you look at a plate of food that has just been put in front of you and you think of saying something nice about it, or do you say that your mother's cooking was better? Even when we mean well, we can be discouraging, can't we? I remember after I'd done my first ever youth group talk, one of the dear old ladies, one of the helpers, she meant very well, but it wasn't as encouraging as she probably hoped it would be when she told me that God can even use bad talks. I remember playing tennis a few years ago on holiday. We were playing doubles, and I had been paired with an elderly gentleman who was well over 80 years old, so you can picture the scene in your mind. I hadn't played for years. I used to play a lot when I was younger, but I hadn't played for years. And Derek was not only far better than me, but he took his tennis extremely seriously. He played at his local club at least twice a week, and I could see that he was getting increasingly irritated with me every time I hit the ball out, which was happening on a regular occurrence. And I could hear him repeatedly muttering under his breath about me, about how useless I was, about how terrible I was at tennis, about how frustrating it was that he was paired with someone like me. And so you can imagine my great delight when he had the easiest of smashes and he hit the ball into the net. And he was well-meaning, or at least I think he was, when he turned to me and he apologized and he said, "I'm sorry, Simon," he said. "I feel like I'm letting you down now." And it was very implicit in his apology that up until that point, it had been me who had been letting him down. His words maybe were well-intentioned, and yet they weren't as encouraging as they could have been. And as we live out our Christian lives, and as we serve the Lord in different ways, both small and big, it's never straightforward, is it? It's always full of ups and downs. So you go through a time of real encouragement, and you think, this is it, this is great, this is how it's going to be from now on. And then it's not long until you go through a time of difficulty and discouragement. And our first heading, verses 1 to 3, is a discouraging perspective. A discouraging perspective. Now, you remember that we can date each of the messages that God gives through Haggai because he does it in relation to the reign of the king. So chapter 1, verses 1 to 11, that was given on the 29th of August, 520 BC. Chapter 1, verses 12 to 15 was given on the 21st of September, 520 BC. So you can see time is moving on. Well, the date here, chapter 2 and verse 1, is the 17th of October, 520 BC. You remember the background. Years ago, Babylon had taken the people of Judah away as captives. They had destroyed the temple, God's house. They had destroyed it by fire, the temple that Solomon had built. 18 years ago or so, however, over 40,000 of them had returned back home to Judah and to Jerusalem. They'd started to rebuild the temple. They'd relaid the foundation, but then they had stopped. And for the last 16 years, the temple has lain in ruins. And so God has sent Haggai to challenge them and to encourage them to start rebuilding his house. We've said that today there isn't a stone temple to go to or that needs to be rebuilt, but there is a spiritual temple, the church, God's people, and we all need to be involved in the building work of seeing people saved, building up God's people. And you ask the question, well, what's happened over the last few days since the 21st of September? What's happened? Well, of course, we saw last week that they did start rebuilding the temple, and they seem to have this sense of togetherness and unity and energy and purpose and zeal. But it's very unlikely that much would have been achieved. And the main reason for this is the religious ceremonies that would have been taking place. So the 17th of October, which is today's date, you remember that? The 17th of October, according to Leviticus 23, was the last ordinary day of the Feast of Tabernacles. So that means for the last 7 days, everyone has been living in temporary shelters as they remember the years Israel spent living in the wilderness. The Feast of Tabernacles was also meant to be a time of harvest thanksgiving for the harvest. And so it was likely, given that the crops and the harvests had been so poor, chapter 1 and verse 6, that the people didn't feel that they had much to give thanks for. It was probably likely that the people didn't feel that they had much to celebrate. A mood of despondency probably hung in the air. And what was really getting people down, however, were the comparisons that were being made between Solomon's glorious temple, the majestic temple and house that Solomon had built for God, and the temple as it was now. And so to deal with this sense of discouragement, God has sent Haggai the prophet to speak again to Zerubbabel and Joshua and the people. And he begins in verse 3 by asking 3 questions. He says, "Who is left among you who saw this house in its former glory? How do you see it now? Is it not as nothing in your eyes?" Now, 16 years ago, when the people had relaid the foundations of the temple, what had been the response and the reactions to that? Well, in Ezra 3, we find that it was mixed. There were 2 very different kinds of responses. So, on the one hand, it was a time of celebration and praise and happiness and worship and thanksgiving, a time of excitement. The foundation of the temple is being relayed. The house of God is going up. It's going to be built again. God is with us. And it was a time of celebration and happiness. And yet, on the other hand, there were people there who couldn't stop the tears running down their face. They couldn't stop crying. And these were the people who were old enough to remember the temple that Solomon had built. Its majesty, its glory, its beauty, its lavishness, its attractiveness, its splendor, its extravagance. And as they looked at the foundations of the temple that was being rebuilt, they were depressed. They were sad. Tears ran down their faces. They were crying. Just a few grey and miserable looking lots of stones. Just these stones. Nothing to adorn it. Very few workers. Slow progress. And from God's questions here in verse 3, that there's clearly the same kind of thing that is going on. Older ones probably, perhaps visiting the building site, coming to the temple complex, maybe leaning on their walking sticks or resting on their Zimmer frames, peering over their glasses, remembering the beautiful, glorious house that it used to be, that Solomon built, and unimpressed by this poor specimen that it was going to become. And you can just imagine their comments. Perhaps words and phrases are being heard by the workers as they caught on the wind. Words and phrases like, "Well, it wasn't like this in my day. Not like the good old days. You remember the good old days. Remember gold and silver and carvings and cedar. Remember the glory days of Solomon. Look at it. It's not very impressive, is it?" In Zechariah 4 and verse 10, it seems that there was a phrase that was popular at the time, and it was this phrase, "a day of small things." A day of small things, and maybe that's what they were muttering to each other. This is a day of small things. Look at the temple, it's a day of small things. It's hardly worth bothering with, hardly worth rebuilding. And maybe they hadn't meditated on Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 10 recently. And maybe they didn't intend their comments to have the effect that they did. Maybe they just thought they were reminiscing about the glory days. And yet, what was the result of such comments? What effect did they have? Well, the result was discouragement. It was discouragement. The leaders and the people there began rebuilding the house of the Lord, and there'd been such a sense of purpose and unity and togetherness and positivity and energy, but now they were discouraged. And what does discouragement do? Does it help? Does it inspire? Does it motivate? No, discouragement, it wears you out. It saps your energy. It makes you want to give up. It demotivates you. It makes you want to stop. You say, well, what's the point? What's the point in me giving all this time and energy, putting all this hard work in? You can see from verse 4 that discouragement weakens. Now, sometimes things do need to be said, and sometimes issues do need to be dealt with, and sometimes it's very hard to do it in a way that doesn't discourage. Sometimes discouragement in different ways is inevitable, but so often discouragement in the work of the Lord is one of Satan's most effective weapons. Satan, he loves to discourage. He loves to discourage. He loves to weaken and make people feel like giving up and just saying, what's the point? It was no wonder that Barnabas was such a standout character in the New Testament. His name means a son of encouragement. He was a man who just encouraged people. It was no wonder that Paul loved Philemon so much. You remember Philemon? Philemon was a refresher. And that's how Paul described him. He refreshed people. He energized people. I wonder, are you an encourager? Do people feel energized by you? And maybe you're in need of encouragement this evening. Maybe you feel down and discouraged and disillusioned. And maybe lockdown is part of the reasons for that. On the one hand, maybe you're so thankful for people who are logging on to different services online across the nation, different churches, and people who don't normally go to church. Some of them are tuning into services, and you're encouraged by that. But maybe at the same time, under these lockdown conditions, you are discouraged because so many of the things that we can normally do as a church, we can't do at the moment, and perhaps you're discouraged by this situation. And so we have here in verses 1 to 3 a discouraging perspective. But then in verses 4 and 5, we find a strengthening focus. A strengthening focus. Let's read verse 3 again and also verse 4. Who is left among you who saw this house in its former glory? How do you see it now? Is it not as nothing in your eyes? Yet now be strong, O Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, O Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord. Work, for I am with you, declares the Lord of hosts. And notice what God says 3 times in verse 4. Be strong, be strong, be strong. He says it to individuals. He says it to leaders. He says it to the people, be strong. In Zechariah 8, in similar circumstances, those words, they come up again. Be strong, be strong. Now, what is God saying? Is God saying, well, go up the gym? Is God saying, just pull yourself together? Is God saying, just look for the strength inside yourself and just get through it? No, God is saying you have a lot to be encouraged by. He's saying you have a lot to be encouraged by. Be strengthened in your heart. See things in perspective. Be positive in your outlook. See things in the right way. Be strong. And while we have the tendency, because we are sinners, to be discouragers, we find that throughout the Bible, because God is good, God is an encourager. Romans 15 and verse 5, for example, he is the God of endurance and encouragement. Who is it that keeps you going? who gives you strength when you are weak, who gives you grace in every trial. It is God. And we see here that it's his heart to bless and to encourage and to strengthen these people. And so he says, be strong and work. But then you notice what he says next. He doesn't say be strong and work, because when it's finished, it's going to look amazing. It's going to look far better than you can imagine. No, looks were the problem in verse 3. The reason why the perspective in verse 3 was a discouraging perspective was because it was the wrong perspective. In verse 3, they were far too focused on what the temple looked like. And they weren't focused enough on what the temple stood for, the presence of God, God being with them. And so God, he says here, he says, be strong and work, for I am with you. It's not human or material resources that you need to focus on. It's God and his presence. In fact, God says that he's always been with them, verse 5, and he says that he will always be with them. He says, work, for I am with you, declares the Lord of hosts, according to the covenant that I made with you when you came out of Egypt. My spirit remains in your midst, fear not. And Nehemiah, referring to God being with his people when they came out of Egypt, he says to God in Nehemiah 9, he says, you in your great mercies did not forsake your people in the wilderness. The pillar of cloud to lead them in the way did not depart from them by day, nor the pillar of fire by night to light for them the way by which they should go. You gave your good spirit to instruct them, and did not withhold your manna from their mouth, and gave them water for their thirst. For 40 years you sustained them in the wilderness, and they lacked nothing. Their clothes did not wear out, and their feet did not swell. God, he says, I covenanted with you. I promised that I would be with you by my spirit. And I was with you, wasn't I? And I'm still with you now. He says, be strong because I am with you. Now, this is very daft, I know, but imagine if you won a competition and the first prize for that competition was to be able to spend an afternoon with the Queen. And it wasn't so much spending an afternoon with the Queen in terms of just going to one of her afternoon garden tea parties, but you were able to organize the afternoon yourself. It was to be your treat. And so you planned a lovely time with her, and you decided that you were going to take her to your favorite restaurant. And we're not even talking McDonald's here. And so the big day comes round and you've booked up this table at your favorite restaurant, and you're nervous and you're excited, and you go and you pick her up from Buckingham Palace in your tiny little car, and you begin driving, and it's wonderful. The Queen is with you. But then it all starts to go wrong. So first of all, the traffic is bad, lots of congestion, and you realize very quickly that your timings are all going down the drain. You're going to be late for the restaurant, and it's a bit of a nightmare, and you're getting frustrated and worked up. And then to make things worse, your car breaks down, and you find yourself on the side of the road, and you have to get out of the car, and you pop up the bonnet, and you're looking over the engine, trying to figure out what's gone wrong, and your hands are getting all black and greasy, and you just can't work out why the car is broken down. And so you phone up the recovery company, but they say they're experiencing a high volume of calls at the moment and call-outs, and they're not going to be able to get to you for at least a couple of hours. And so in your desperation, you phone up a member of your family or a friend who's a mechanic and ask if they can come out and help you, and they can't. They're sorry about that. And so that's all your options gone. And then to top it all, the sky turns really dark, and these black clouds come overhead, and it starts to rain, really big raindrops. And it's not long before you're absolutely soaked as you're pacing up and down outside the car. And it's at this point that it finishes you off. You just can't believe it. It's just such a nightmare. You get all worked up. It's all gone so wrong. You love that little restaurant. You planned such a lovely afternoon. But then out of the corner of your eye, you see a gloved hand and you hear a little knock on the window. And you turn around and you realize that as you've been bent over the engine and you've been pacing up and down around outside in the rain, you've forgotten all about who you have with you. You've forgotten that you've got the Queen with you. The Queen, she doesn't need to wait for a breakdown company to come out. She's not dependent on your limited circumstances. She has all the resources of the kingdom at her disposal. She has golden carriages drawn by horses. She has Rolls Royces and Bentleys and Daimlers. She can have a helicopter come and pick you up within seconds. The Queen is not limited by your resources. You've got the Queen with you. And here are these people in Haggai's day, and they're getting discouraged and they're getting down about their limited resources. And it's as if God has to knock on the window and remind them of who is with them. They have the Lord of hosts with them. They have the God of the universe with them. They have the God who has all the resources in the world with them. They have the most important person, the most glorious person among them. And I wonder whether this is what you need reminding of this evening. Do you need to be strengthened by being brought back to this focus? You remember what Jesus said when he sent out his disciples at the end of Matthew 28 with the Great Commission. He said, "All authority in heaven and on earth is given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything that I have taught you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." He says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Your situation may be limited. Your resources may seem to be small. Things on the surface may change. But Jesus is with you. The Lord of hosts is with the church. The one who sits on the throne of the universe, who's in charge and in control of everything, he is with his people. And we need our focus again and again and again to be brought back to him. And we need to ensure that we don't lose sight of him. We need to keep our eyes looking unto Jesus, the author and the perfecter of our faith. And we need to keep our eyes on the one who said that I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. We have here a strengthening focus. And then finally, verses 6 to 9, we have the encouragement of God's promises. We have the encouragement of God's promises. Having said that he was with them in these verses, God, he reminds them of what he's capable of, and he shares with them what he's going to do. And there are 4 things here that I want to highlight. So firstly, he says that he's going to shake. He's going to shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land. And he says, I will shake all nations. This is the language of political upheaval. So while one superpower emerges, another declines. While one king comes to the throne, another is deposed. While one person is made prime minister, another person has to step down. Why do these things happen? It's because God is shaking things up. God is always constantly shaking things up in the political realm. And one day, Hebrews 12, he's going to shake everything, and only his kingdom is going to stand. Of course, the people of Judah at this time, they were ruled by the superpower of Persia. Back in the glory days, Solomon had been their king. He'd supplied huge amounts of gold and silver for the original temple, but now they didn't even have a king. And they were controlled by this foreign power, and they were discouraged and they were down. And all they had were bits of wood taken from the hills and stone. And yet God is saying here, he's saying, remember who is with you. He's saying, remember that I am with you. And remember that I am a king not just of a tiny nation. I'm the king of the universe. And I'm going to shake things up. And what's going to be the result of God shaking things up? Well, the second thing that God said he would do was that he would make the treasures of the nations flow towards the temple. I look at verse 8. God, he doesn't just own the cattle on 1,000 hills. No, he owns all the gold and silver in the world. He owns every penny in every bank, every gold bar in every bank reserve. It's all his. You think of what God did in Ezra 6. In Ezra 6, Darius, the Persian king, he starts to give state revenues to pay for the building of the temple in Jerusalem. And you say, why on earth did he start to do that? Well, it was because God shook things up. And the treasures of the nation started to come in and pay for the temple. Now you think of the wise men bringing their treasures from the east and laying them at the feet of Jesus in Matthew 2. You think of the kings of the earth at the end of time, bringing the glories of their nations to God. God is in control. God is able to bring the treasures of the world to where he wants it. He's able to provide the resources that his people need. You see, thirdly, that he promises glory. Verse 9, he says that the glory of this temple will be greater than Solomon's temple. Now he says that he would fill this temple with glory. Now this must have left them scratching their heads, because he's saying here that the glory of the house that they're building is going to be greater than the glory of Solomon's temple. They must have thought, well, what could God have meant? He could have meant that it would be more attractive, because it wasn't. He couldn't have meant that it would have been more expensive, because it wasn't. He has to be referring to his presence, the ultimate glory. When Solomon held that great worship service of dedication, when the temple was finished, you remember the glory cloud of the Lord, it descended upon it, and it was an amazing day. Great blessing, the glory of God in the cloud coming down on the temple. And yet what God is referring to with this temple is something even better. You see, who was it ultimately who came to this temple? I know that Herod renovated it, but who ultimately came to this temple? Who was it who walked through its courts? Well, it was none other than God himself, wasn't it? In the person of his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ. The Lord Jesus came to this temple. And here God promises hundreds of years before it happens that the glory of this house will be a glory like never before. The glory of God coming to this house in the person of Jesus Christ. And what motivation for these builders to be encouraged in working on this house. And then fourthly, what else did God promise? Well, you see there in verse 9 that he promised peace. He promised peace. And in this place I will give peace, declares the Lord of hosts. What was going to happen not very far away from this temple on the hill of Calvary? Well, the Son of God was going to die in agony on a lonely cross. He was going to be offered up as the ultimate lamb, as a sacrifice for sin. The great high priest himself was going to lay down his life as a sacrifice and a substitute and a ransom for many. And this great high priest was going to reconcile heaven and earth. And what was going to happen in this temple that they were building as Jesus laid down his life? Well, unseen divine hands were going to tear the temple curtain from top to bottom into an access into God's presence, into the most holy place was going to be given, because peace had been bought through the blood of the cross. And what a noble, worthwhile work these people were doing. On the outside, it didn't look very impressive at all. And yet what it stood for, what God planned for it, was impressive. And you know, it may be that you feel that as you live out your life for the Lord, as as you try to serve him in different ways, maybe it just doesn't feel very impressive. And maybe you feel that all you can do now is just pray for the building up of the house, for the saving of people's souls, for the building up of people into Christ. Maybe you feel that all you can do is pray, as if that's only something that is small. And yet, who is it that graces this spiritual house with his presence? It's none other than God the Holy Spirit, isn't it? And who knows what plans God may have in answer to your prayers or using those small things that you do. I think of the church back in Crowborough. I think it was back in the 80s. The first time they really distributed anything to the houses of Crowborough was back in the 80s, I think, and that they distributed copies of the Gospel of John. And they've distributed many things over the years, and there has been some fruit, but not a massive amount of fruit. But in that first time of putting things through people's doors, knocking on the door, giving something from the church, giving the Gospel of John, there was one family who there was an interest in what they read, and they started coming to the church. And the surname of that family was Cowley. And of course, John Cowley was just a lad at that point from a non-Christian background. And it was through something which seemed quite unimpressive and small that led to John becoming a Christian. And now he's the pastor of the church there and has been used for many years in the lives of many people. And so often we may think that what we're doing is so small and so unimpressive, just putting something through someone's door. And yet what God may plan for it may be something far more glorious. And it certainly was here with this temple.